everyone talks about this minimum viable product, and it's a very exciting concept when it first came out and got people very excited. But then most people couldn't really figure out what does minimum viable mean, right? And the thing to keep in mind is that your lack of resources and your constraints and your desire to intersect the market early and get feedback, these are all your problems. These are not your customer's problems, just to be clear, right? The customer doesn't care that if you live or die is kind of immaterial and orthogonal to their sort of daily life, right? And so you might want to build a minimum viable product so that you don't make mistakes or overbuild or whatever, and it's a very desirable goal. But that's your customer doesn't think like that, and he should not, and they should not have to think like that in order to sort of support you, right? And so the important question is always that from a customer perspective, you really have to fulfill a need, right? So if you look at this diagram, I think it sort of articulates it well, right? Like a single wheel is not very useful, and two wheels connected with an axle is not very useful. And what you need is a car, right? But if you give someone a wheel and then two wheels and then add an axle to it and then finally end up with a car, the chances are your customer will lose interest, right? And so that's the bad way to build an MVP. The better way to build an MVP is to say, hey, the customer really cares about going from point A to point B. And I'm going to, build something very straightforward and see if getting from point A to point B is actually useful, right? And maybe they buy a scooter and then they're like, actually, I hate going from point A to point B. I like my house. I want to stay at my house. And if that's what you discover once you've built a scooter, it saves you the trouble of building the next 3 iterations, right? Because then it shows you that what you're building is not useful, right? Because you haven't been able to satisfy the customer's core sort of loop. And that's a very critical thing when you're trying to think about PMF as well, right? Which is, as the MVP plays into the PMF, when you have product market fit, it's very hard to do anything else because your customers are just yelling for product on constantly, right? And so lots of people think PMF just means that their customer said some good things about the product, and that's not real PMF, right? And so as you're building MVPs that are very focused on solving customer core loop concerns, at some point along this duration, you will actually hopefully hit PMF, right? And when you hit PMF and you're like, actually what people want to do is they want to go from point A to point B, but they also want their head covered. They want to be inside a safe rectangle. They want to feel safe. They want to be able to control the speed. These are the things you've discovered along the way, right? And so you can now you can start the process of building a Ferrari if that's what you want. And, you're like, hey, some people really care about the style of it. Some people really care about performance. Some people just want to sit in the back seat and sleep. These are all things that you discover along the way, right? And that's what you get when you build an MVP well, right? Is that you get a chance to really uncover very deep and profound user requirements that you can then sort of go and build a company around, right? And that's what makes it exciting. This whole concept of a core loop, right? Your business exists around a core loop, right? And it's a combination of product plus distribution plus network effects. Sometimes it's community, but it is a much more complicated thing than just product features. Lots of people pick products and features, and that's kind of normal. Not very few people pitch me a core loop. And I find that to be very interesting because a core loop is a great way to communicate to investors and to people who are like, strategic, how something becomes very, very, very large, right? And in the beginning, it's very hard to make the argument that you're going to be very large because everybody can make that argument, right? But if you are able to demonstrate, hey, this is the core loop that I can build, and I can take this core loop and sort of, start what is called a flywheel, right? Which is that every action creates positive momentum towards another action, right? And what you get is, a loop that sort of keeps gaining in energy and momentum. That's what's interesting about core loops, right? Which is that the flywheel effect, right? And so would strongly urge people as they're thinking about what they're building is to say, okay, here's a product, here's a set of features, here's a set of mockups, etc. But think also a little bit about the core loop. How do I know that something can monetize, right? That's the sort of question that in order to answer, building a core loop is a great way of doing it. Because that can help you answer the question, which is how do I capture economic value in such a way that people can give me some of it, right? If you're able to create a core loop and capture some economic value, then you will actually find that monetizing it is not very hard, because people are like, well, I'm generating XYZ sort of economic value. I'm happy to give you a percentage of it. That does not feel like an insane requirement, right? And so that's an important part of sort of, just thinking about how something like that is done. The point that I just want to drive home is that core loops aren't just in software. Every business actually can have a core loop. In fact, every business does have a core loop, right? There's a flywheel effect, and if it's Amazon or if it's Walmart or if it's anybody, you can get the flywheel going. What that does is that it basically helps you compound your PMF, right? So as you've sort of found product market fit and it has started to go better and better, if the flywheel starts to rip, then that, you just sort of keep adding more and more value for yourself and keep compounding that. That's very powerful. There are habit forming core loops. There are core loops that, focus on the business themselves in terms of, if you take a very gaming approach to life, then, core loops and games are really about how do you get a user hooked and, keep delivering sort of, hits to them so that they can keep going. But it can actually be for any business, right? Which is, it just shows the concept of a virtuous sort of cycle. The other sort of big question, right, which comes up a lot is, there's, of course, you can limit your features and prioritize very heavily, but you can't build something that does not have, that does not have the appropriate level of quality for the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. Because again, just to remind you all over again, the fact that you have constrained resources and you have to sort of, move your business forward and get your startup humming with, low amounts of money and low amounts of people is your problem. It's not your customer's problem, right? And so your customers don't care. But what your customer does care about is that the level of quality is matches what is being built, right? If you're building something where, if it's a game or if it's a, hey, I'm going to ask you some fun questions and give you some fun answers, people don't expect that stuff to be the highest quality, right? It's okay. You can have a little bit of, you can have a little bit of an issue there once in a while, and people aren't going to be, sort of cut up about it, right? But, you're not going to trust your credit card to somebody who does not look like they know how to handle a freaking website error, right? Like, if there's a website error and the website hangs, I, for one, I'm very nervous now about putting in any financial data because I don't want them to sort of, lose it and steal it and things like that, right? And so quality is not really something that, especially when you're building something early, is not something that you can actually mess around with a whole lot, right? And it is a little bit of a function of the problem statement that you've decided to focus on and what your customers expect in terms of quality, right? So there's not a lot of leeway in this particular lever as you're thinking about prioritization and where to, potentially skimp and save some resources so that you can, build something at a lower cost, right?